Joining me in the studio today is Ian McDiarmid, City of London tour guide and general London historian know-it-all. Ian, welcome back.
Hello, Hazel. Nice to be here.
We're going to be talking about a rather interesting character, John Wilkes, born in Clerkenwell, I understand.
Yes, he's partly of interest to us because of the London connection. So he's born in London and he lives most of his life in London. So he's born in, as you say, in Clerkenwell, in St John's Square. And this is more your area of expertise, Hazel, but I know it relatively well, that if you walk through St John's Gate heading northwards, you come into St John's Square. And now it's rather just a sorry looking bit of big road, but it was back then a square. And Wilkes's father is a wealthy distiller, and his distillery is just in that square. And later on, he buys a house at the end of the square, and Wilkes is born there. And then, in terms of pinning him down in London, he later buys a house in Great George Street, which is the one running just to the north of Parliament Square. And he lives at number 13 Great George Street, which unfortunately is no longer there. I think it's on it was on the site of what is now occupied by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. But if you know that street, or if you happen to be going there, and you look at the RICS on the bit is number 14, which does survive. So this was the house that was, I think, next door to Wilkes at number 13, and is pretty similar to the house he lived in, so you can see that. And then he later moves to Prince's Court, which is no longer there, and then finally ends up, when he's set up and doing rather well in his old age, on Grosvenor Square. So London's very much the background to it. And more importantly than his domestic arrangements is obviously the fact that London is the centre of political life. And one of the things we'll be talking about is run-ins with the government over the issue of his publication, The North Briton. And he has enormous difficulty, which we'll come to, in getting this thing published. He decides he wants to publish the whole thing after it becomes very controversial. And he actually converts his house in Great George Street into a printing press to do that. So that's quite an important site for him.
So we're saying his name, but how would people maybe know him or recognise him?
Well, in the 1760s and early 1770s, you really couldn't avoid him. He was the biggest news story in England and probably the most recognisable person after the king. And it's significant that George III detested him, although later on, when they sort of mellowed into old age, they get on okay. But George III detests Wilkes. And he is the number one news story. He's important in a longer term because he's really the first politician to address what the social elites of the day would call the inferior sort, i.e. ordinary people. And he's the first politician to really try and mobilise popular opinion, as we would call it, behind his cause. So in his political career, he goes out and addresses the lower sort of people in London in particular, but he's also addressing the whole nation through the medium of print. He produces handbills, he produces speeches, and there are lots of Wilkes memorabilia. His supporters will wear blue ribbons. There will be buttons produced with number 45, which is the most famous edition of his publication, The North Briton. And Wilkes and Liberty will become a common cry. And I think this fits in with the sort of expansion of English manufacturing, because the Wilkes phenomenon occurs almost immediately after the Wolfe phenomenon. So General Wolfe is killed in 1759 at the Battle of Quebec, and there's a huge outpouring of ceramics to celebrate Wolfe and, as I say, memorabilia, prints and the rest of it. And the similar thing happens to Wilkes. And Wilkes, in a way, is fortunate because he was very ugly. I use the word ugly in inverted commas, and I justify it on the grounds that it was one that description that he sometimes applied to himself, and certainly one that his critics applied to him. But what we can say is he's very distinctive looking, and he had a very pronounced squint, and his squint was so bad that if he was reading, he had to hold one hand over one of his eyes. Though interestingly, this visual impairment did not prevent him from fighting a couple of duels. Yeah, he was also very courageous. And in addition to having very crossed eyes, he also had a very pronounced jaw. Um, and I said that this didn't stop him from dueling. It also didn't stop him from being a great ladies' man. And I think this is because he was just very charming and very clever with words. But anyway, coming back to his physical appearance, he has run-ins with lots of people. His most important run-in, the reason he is so famous is because of his run-ins with the government. But he has a run-in with lots of famous people in the 18th century, one of whom is Hogarth. And Hogarth does a satirical print of Wilkes at one of his trials, in which he's obviously being very derogatory about Wilkes. And he does this kind of caricature, and he plays up the squint, he plays up the pronounced jaw. And because I was saying earlier that Wilkes supporters go around shouting Wilkes and liberty, one of the things he's often shown with is the cap of liberty. So the cap of liberty, a known 18th century symbol of liberty that will later be taken up by the French revolutionaries. And it's often shown as a kind of cap on a pole. In Hogarth's print, the cap of liberty looks very much like a chamber pot. And Wilkes is wearing a wig which looks as though it's also the horns of the devil. Anyway, Wilkes, I think, is initially slightly offended by this print, but he realizes that it's great material and it's a great way of being recognized. And a lot of the images of Wilkes that will appear on mugs and the rest of it bear more than a passing resemblance to this unpleasant print of him by Hogarth. And you can see him every now and then. I remember years ago going around. Stowe was the house of Lord Temple, who is basically Pitt's patron. He builds a new wing, and if you look up towards the roof of this new wing, you can see Wilkes's face peering out at you, and it's immediately recognisable because of his very distinct features.
I don't know if there's something personal going on with the whole Hogarth and Wilkes thing, though, because both their dads had businesses in St. John's Square.
Oh, yes, that's a good point.
Yeah.
There definitely was something personal. I think Wilkes wrote an article criticising Hogarth. Hogarth is quite elderly at this stage, and not just Wilkes, but other people say that he's past his best, but goes into print saying this, that he's basically a doddery old fool now and nobody's interested in him. And I think Hogarth is very upset by this, and this provokes him into making this depiction of Wilkes.
But he turns it around, though, doesn't he? He uses it as his own then.
Yes, very much, and he's also often makes jokes about his appearance as well. So I think he puts a very brave face on it, really, and gets on with it and realises the propaganda value. Because, as I say, wandering around today, there aren't that many depictions of him, but as I say, you see this statue leering out of you from the heights at Stowe, and you immediately recognise it as John Wilkes. So his face became really a trademark.
And what can you say? Can you say a bit about the background that allowed Wilkes to mobilise these ordinary people?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at the 18th century political system, the electoral system, one could say to use the word design would be wrong because it's something that's grown up organically, but its effect is to anchor power in the social elites and to exclude the people we were talking about before, the inferior sort. However, electoral system has been changed over the centuries by the growth in population, growth in wealth, and inflation, and all of these erode the property qualifications that are at the heart of a lot of the franchises. And the electoral system, and one other key development is the expansion of London, and Wilkes's political career will be centred on the county of Middlesex, and this is very much to do with the expansion of London's population. And looking at it, it's a complicated system, the 18th century voting system, but essentially the seats are divided into two kinds. You've got the counties and you've got the boroughs. And I'll just talk about England because Scotland and Wales are slightly different. But the counties return 2 members and you have a 40 shilling freehold qualification. So if you own a property that has a rental value, or if you're living in a property with a rental value of £2 a year, 40 shillings, you get the vote. That's the counties. So they're fairly easy to comprehend. There's a uniform system there, although actually detailed in its application, it wasn't always uniform, but we'll leave that to one side. You've also got the boroughs, and the boroughs in general return 1 MP, but they can return 2, and this being a complicated system, it can even be more. So the City of London returns 4 MPs. And the borough franchises are varied. The right to vote can be dependent on being a member of the corporation, the town council. It can be restricted to freedmen, and you become, if you want to become a freedman, you do it by serving an apprenticeship, or you can do it through purchase. The right to vote can be vested in the ownership of certain properties, and they're known as burgage boroughs. And then finally, you've got the Scott and Lot boroughs, where it's basically householders. You've got freehold boroughs, where the right to vote is restricted to people who own freeholders. And finally, you have Potwalloper boroughs, where resident males can vote. There's only a handful of those. And it's a complicated system, lots of differences. But the key thing is that in about half of the boroughs, the electorate is less than 100. And these are constituencies which are very much subject to the influence of the wealthy, in particular landholders. And the influence works through social deference, the influence works through bribery, and can also work through intimidation. If you don't vote the way your landlord wants you to, and you probably would do anyway because of deference, but if you don't, he could chuck you out. And in particular, contemporaries are very interested in the issue of so-called pocket boroughs. They're called pocket boroughs because they are basically owned by a wealthy individual, normally an aristocrat. But within this system, there is scope for some kind of genuine public opinion to emerge. So the counties have, in general, about 3,000 electors. So they're quite difficult to control, and they're quite expensive. If you do want to win one, that you're going to have to put around a lot of money to try and influence the voters in the county, and you're not going to be able to have precise control of it. There are also some very large constituencies, and this is where Middlesex comes in. Yorkshire has a very large electorate, very big county. The borough of Westminster has a very substantial electorate. The City of London has a substantial electorate, although that's a little bit odd because there are lots of people, there's quite a lot of hierarchical influence in the City of London. And then you get Middlesex, as I say. And Middlesex is the county that existed until 1965, which covered the area north of the Thames, which is now occupied by London, essentially, excluding the City of London and excluding Westminster, which, as I've already alluded to, return their own MPs. So it's a substantial area. And for example, it included Islington, was part of Middlesex. And to the east, it extended as far as the River Lee, which the River Lee joins the Thames just east of the Isle of Dogs. And this area, two things about it. One is that the population was quite large. The number of people qualifying for the 40 shilling freehold was quite large. It was probably about 4,000, so slightly larger than most counties. But most significantly of all, within this area, you've got lots and lots of artisans and craftspeople who qualify for this. These people are not subject to the influence of squire and parson you get having such a heavy influence on politics elsewhere. So it's a bit of an odd case. Now, when Wilkes first enters Parliament, he enters Parliament for Aylesbury. His wife's family are very big landowners in Aylesbury. And in Aylesbury, this is a borough. There are about 400 electors. It costs Wilkes a lot of money. You can see from the correspondence that his sort of team estimate how much it's going to cost to win the votes in Aylesbury, and the price I think varies from sort of something like a guinea up to £5 to buy a vote there. Not all of the votes are to be bought. Some of the voters are genuine independents, but nevertheless it costs Wilkes a lot of money. Uses a lot of influence, and he's elected as MP for Aylesbury. But then later on, he focuses on Middlesex, and he's making an appeal to popular opinion when he does that, and it's very deliberate when he does.
And what was North Britain?
The North Britain was a publication of Wilkes that was a parody of government propaganda. So in 1760, George III ascends to the throne, and he brings in as his first minister the man who'd been his tutor, the Earl of Bute. And it looks as though Bute at this time is pronounced Boot, because Bute is a very unpopular figure. And one of the ways his unpopularity is manifested is by London crowds carrying around boots with them, which they will then ceremoniously burn or hang. And one aspect of his popularity is that when they're carrying around boots, they also carry around a petticoat, and the petticoat symbolises George III's mother. And this reflects rumours, which Wilkes is very keen to give wider publicity to in his own publication, that was involved romantically with the Dowager Princess of Wales, George III's mother, which is one of the reasons why George III hates Wilkes so much. Bute comes in and he's very unpopular, partly because he is Scottish and he stuffs a lot of the political appointments with fellow Scots. That doesn't play very well south of the border. He and George III are also very unpopular because they are known to want to have a negotiated peace with France. So we're talking about the 7 Years' War, which runs from 1756 to 1763. And this is a war that had begun very badly for the British, but which had been turned around by William Pitt, the elder Pitt. And 1759, which is the year when Wolfe dies, is the probably the biggest year for British victories any time. And notably, they drive the French from Canada, they drive the French from India, and they drive the French from the West Indies. And Pitt loses influence with the accession of George III, and obviously Bute comes in to replace him. And they all suspect, rightly, that in a sense, George III and Bute are going to sell them out. They're going to go for a negotiated peace with the French. And when the peace is signed in 1763, in the eyes of the Patriot Party, that's of Pitt, there is indeed a sellout because the British give back the Caribbean islands, which they'd captured, to the French. And there's a story that the French diplomat negotiating the Treaty of Paris is given instructions which run along the lines of, yeah, if you have to agree to the abandonment of Canada, we can live with that. But whatever you get back, Guadeloupe. So that kind of, if you just think of an atlas and the scale of the two countries and how much that reflects how important the sugar trade, and obviously we're talking about the slave economy here, is to these powers. Anyway, Bute and George III are unpopular because they're suspected of going for a sellout peace. And because they're unpopular, they want to try and counter that by having sort of government propaganda, and they get Smollett to produce a publication called Britain. And it's because of this title that Wilkes comes out with North Britain being a kind of patriotic word for Scottish people who want to be involved in the Union. So if you were a sort of polite member of the Scottish elite living in Edinburgh at this time, you'd probably describe yourself as a North Briton to show your loyalty to the Hanoverian regime. And so the title itself is taking aim at Bute and his Scottish contacts. The publication is outrageous. It's a great success. And then we come to issue number 45, in which Wilkes says that either the king or his ministers are lying. And both of those are a no-no. You can imagine the reason saying that the ministers are lying is a no-no is because, in theory, what Wilkes is talking about is the King's speech to Parliament made by his ministers. And there's a kind of tradition that if you were to criticise the King's ministers whilst making this speech, you would be libelling the King. So this is completely outrageous. And the government seek to shut Wilkes up and to punish him. And they issue a general warrant for the arrest of the printers and publishers of the North Briton, and Wilkes is committed to the Tower. Now, the fact that they do this through a general warrant is significant because general warrants were warrants for the arrest of unnamed people. So they named the crime, but they didn't name the people, and will go to trial, and he will argue that these are illegal. And he's arguing that they infringe the traditional liberties of an Englishman. And I think legally there was a lot of debate about this because actually general warrants had been used for quite some time, but Wilkes was arguing that they were an innovation and an innovation of despotism on the part of the Crown. And Wilkes is put on trial, and he is released because of parliamentary privilege. The judge rules that because of parliamentary privilege, he can't be put on, his arrest was essentially illegal. But we'll go on to argue the case about general warrants over other times he's on trial, and he will eventually win, and he will outlaw general warrants. Now, after he's released on because of parliamentary privilege, what does Wilkes do? Well, he thinks, I've got a good idea. I'll reprint the entire North Britain, including number 45. And unfortunately for him at the same time, he also has the idea of printing a scurrilous poem that he's written known as the Essay on Woman. And this is a parody of Pope's Essay on Man. And it is completely lewd. And the joke here is not just men making jokes about women. It's a bit more to it than that. It's personal because it's a parody of Bishop Warburton of Gloucester. Now, this poem was possibly largely written by a friend of Wilkes called Potter, who it is alleged had an affair with the bishop's wife. And the two men, the bishop and Potter, hated each other. And what Potter and Wilkes do is they satirise an edition of Warburton's on Pope's Essay on Man, in which the bishop had produced this edition and written a lot of erudite and very pompous footnotes. And Potter and Wilkes scatter their scurrilous poem, Essay on Woman, with lots of footnotes that parody the footnotes made by the bishop on the original Pope poem. So that's the kind of joke behind it. But the poem does open Wilkes up to two possible vulnerabilities. The one is that the poem is scurrilous, so it can be done for blasphemy and indecency. And also the bishop will later be able to claim that he has been libelled and that this is an infringement of his parliamentary privilege because he sits in the House of Lords. And the government wants to get back at Wilkes because he's been arrested and he's been released on a technicality, and they get wind of the fact he wants to reprint the number 45. But they also see this Essay on Woman as a chance to get to him as well. Now, what Wilkes wants to do is he wants to reprint. So Wilkes has this project to publish both the Essay on Woman and the number 45, but he doesn't really have the resources to do this. It's a huge project, and he gives up on the poem. But the government solicitor, Carteret Webb, gets hold of the unpublished Essay on Woman. Gets hold of it in a rather dubious manner by intimidating and bribing one of Wilkes's employees. So essentially it's stolen.
They spent a lot of effort trying to retrieve that. So why was that important?
They saw it as a weapon for getting at Wilkes. They're expressing outrage at this, but one of the people involved in trying to get Wilkes on this was the Earl of Sandwich, who himself was a notorious rake. They saw it as a vulnerability, and so they get it. And as I say, it was an outrageous poem, but Wilkes had a very strong legal defence in that, one, he'd never actually printed it, and secondly, they'd acquired it basically by stealing it. What happens is that because number 45 is ruled to be a libel, the public hangman is instructed to burn it in front of the Royal Exchange, and in December he goes to do that. But the problem is that the hangman, when he goes to carry out the destruction of the work, is pelted by the London crowd, and he's pelted with bits of wood, and he's also pelted with bits of dirt. And if you think what kind of dirt's going to be available to you on the streets of London, it's probably a fairly unpleasant experience. And the crowd actually prevent the burning of number 45. They remove the faggots from the fire. They take the publication off the fire itself. So it's a sort of great popular demonstration in favour of Wilkes. But Wilkes has a problem because Parliament rules that parliamentary privilege does not apply to him in the case of seditious libel, is when you libel the Crown. And fearing punishment, he then takes himself off to France. And in his absence, he's failed to come in for sentencing to the court. He is made an outlaw, and he's, as I say, he's sitting in France, he's an exile, he's an outlaw, and he has a practical problem there. And the practical problem is that his debts are mounting up all the time. And after a while, he thinks it might be a good idea if he comes back to England in the hope that he could then become an MP and then be protected by parliamentary privilege from being pursued by his debtors. And eventually he comes back, and in 1768, and he makes the decision to stand for Middlesex. This is a momentous decision. He originally wants to stand for the city. That doesn't work out, but he then turns his attention on Middlesex, and it's because of those things that we were talking about earlier on, that Middlesex has a genuinely free, in inverted commas, electorate, and that if Wilkes is elected, it will be shown to be the will of England choosing him as his MP.
I think that the celebrations afterwards prove that fact as well, don't they?
Yes, it leads to, when he is elected, it leads to 2 days of riotous celebrations through London. I think I might have mentioned earlier that the electorate is estimated in Middlesex at 4,000. Wilkes produces 40,000 handbills for this election, which shows a great deal of industry on his part. But I think there are a couple of things going on here. I mean, I was saying earlier that Wilkes is often regarded as the first modern politician. He's often regarded as the sort of father of English radicalism. But in these handbills, they're very much concerned with saying to his supporters, you've got to behave properly. We don't want riotous behaviour. We don't want people being intimidated. We don't want you rioting. And I think this is playing a double game. On the one hand, he's saying to the superior sort and the kind of people that wanted to get rid of him, look, outwardly, I'm in control of these people. But just imagine if I wasn't and they were set loose. So behind all the kind of modern politics of making an appeal to people on the basis of political ideas, there's also a threat. In some ways, this is just a traditional, some of his followers are just a traditional mob. In a way, he's talking to two audiences. He's talking to the electors of Middlesex, and he's talking to what many people would regard as the mob. And there's a kind of implicit threat in there of widespread trouble if Wilkes is no longer in control of these people and if the government are making concessions.
I must admit, I do think that Winston Graham, who wrote Poldark, he must have read about John Wilkes, because so much of this kind of threat that you're talking about now and Wilkes using his constituents is exactly what Poldark does in the books, and also the latest Aidan Turner version as well, about, look, I can't really control them, but if you give me a chance, I might just be able to hold them in, and you landowner be able to sleep in your bed safe tonight, but you've got to give me a little bit of leverage, you've got to give me that power. It sounds so it must have been happening all over the country. What was it about him? His father runs the brewery in St. John's Square, so he's not of the upper classes. He is a member of the Hellfire Club, though, isn't he?
Yeah, well,
and he's a real womanizer. Maybe that's why people like him, because he's able to get away from the social norms.
I think that his womanizing probably didn't do him too much harm. I think people realised that he was a bit of a character, and as I mentioned earlier, the fact he fought duels and was a bit of a libertine probably did his reputation no harm amongst the sort of the male electors of the time. But I think the main thing, the reason why he's popular is because he is prepared to go to prison on a point of principle in protesting against a very unpopular government. George III at the beginning of his reign is extremely unpopular, and particularly the Earl of Bute, and he stands up to them. The key thing, I was saying that he, in terms of his legacy, he's often regarded as the father of radicalism, sometimes the first of the modern politicians. But the people who sustain that argument have a bit of trouble in that there's no real coherent program behind it. But what he does all the time, he's constantly being put on trial by the government. And I think this is significant in terms of Wilkes' own thinking, because he's making an appeal to the common law, and he's making an appeal to the ancient liberties of an Englishman, that the Englishman should not be subject to a despotic government. One of the things when they use the general warrant to arrest him is they don't just arrest him, which he regards as illegal. They also search and trash his house at the same time. And he makes a big fuss about this being illegal as well, that an Englishman has a right to private property and the government can't go in. And so there isn't. Later on in his career, he will make speeches in favour of universal male suffrage. He will make speeches in favour of religious toleration. He will make speeches in favour of the American colonies who are rebelling against England. But the core to his political activity is basically standing on trial and saying, I'm being persecuted, by a despotic authoritarian government. This is outrageous. This is against the time-honoured liberties of Englishmen. And as such, you need to put him in a kind of almost conservative with a small c tradition, going back to the 17th century, when people obviously were very concerned, people in Parliament were very concerned about what they saw as an overbearing monarchy. So he looks both ways in that sense.
I can understand the principle element as well. If you stand up for your own beliefs, he presents himself to the King's Bench, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. What he does is he comes back, and so he comes back. He is elected as MP for Middlesex, and then he presents himself to the King's Bench. And whilst he's on the way to the King's Bench, the London crowd capture him, and they turn the coach around. And Wilkes actually has to escape from the crowds and then turn himself into the King's Bench almost in secret. And again, this sort of plays to his "oh, I'm so good, I obey the law" image, and he wins a lot of plaudits because he turns himself, he escapes from the mob and turns himself into the law. He's in the King's Bench prison, which is in Southwark, newly constructed there, and he is awaiting sentencing on the outstanding trials. And then Parliament opens in May, and a huge crowd assembles outside the King's Bench prison on the assumption that Wilkes is going to be taken from the prison to Westminster for the opening day of Parliament. Now, that doesn't happen. There's a huge crowd, and it's assembled on what was known as St George's Field. And the magistrates call in the soldiers, and one of the crowd throws a stone at one of the JPs, and the soldiers go in after him, and they chase him, and eventually they track him down. They think they've tracked him down, and they shoot him, but they've shot the wrong person. And that's the sort of the beginning of the things going wrong. They shoot the son of a publican, and this young man becomes a symbol for the Wilkes and Liberty movement later on. He becomes, yes, an important symbol for that. But in addition, later on, the soldiers will actually fire into the crowd, and they kill 5 or 6 of them. And this is known as the St George's Field Massacre. And again, Wilkes is able to make great play of this. It makes him enormously popular because he criticises the actions of the authorities in being so brutal. Eventually he's there, and he's sentenced to a year in prison and to pay a fine of £500 for libelling the king, and the House of Commons expels him. And this leads to an extraordinary series of events whereby Wilkes is excluded. He's elected MP and excluded a total of 4 times. And on the third occasion, when he's returned, he's largely been returned. The first election he wins. The second and third times he's unopposed. The 4th time the government they find a man named Luttrell to stand against him. And they have the election, Wilkes wins. Luttrell gets a quarter of the votes of Wilkes. But then the House of Commons vote that Wilkes is incapacitated from taking his seat, and they replace him with Luttrell. And this just adds ammunition to the Wilkite cause, because in previous occasions his election has been declared null and void. But in this case, the government actually decides who is going to be the MP, although the MP Luttrell got less votes than Wilkes. And of course, this is a huge issue because it means that the government ultimately can appoint MPs. And there's huge outrage from this. And this leads the Wilkite cause to explode. And in particular, it leads to a petitioning movement. And this petitioning movement occurs all over England, whereby counties send in petitions complaining about the election of Luttrell and asking that the rights of voters be guaranteed. And there are something like 60,000 signatures involved in these petitions. And if you remember, I was saying at the beginning, the total electorate for all of Britain is estimated at something like 300,000. It's a huge number.
Pretty impressive, really, when you think about, like, now we have change.org. You know, a few clicks on your own mobile or computer, whereas actually to gather physical signatures,
yes,
60,000 of them, that's impressive.
Yes, a huge thing. Later on, in 1774, Wilkes will again be elected MP as Westminster, and this time eventually he's allowed to sit. But by about this time, really, the impetus has gone from behind the movement. Wilkes he still stands up and makes speeches of saying he champions the causes of the American colonists, but he doesn't have the same kind of following as he had before. And one of the things he does later on in 1778 is he votes for the Catholic Relief Act. Now, the Catholics have been labouring under all kinds of restrictions, and this, which is known as the First Catholic Relief Act, allows them to inherit and buy and sell property. And most significantly, from the popular perception of this act, is it allows them to serve in the armed forces. And the background to this is that Britain is fighting a war in America. It would be very helpful to get the Quebecois, the French-speaking inhabitants of Canada, on the British side, but because of British laws, they're prohibited from, because they're Catholic, they're prohibited from serving in the forces. So one cause for this piece of legislation is a practical one. But Wilkes speaks in favour of it because he's in favour of religious toleration. And this loses him quite a lot of support amongst the sort of more rabid Protestants. And this act will lead in 1780 to the Gordon riots, which are huge anti-Catholic riots. And Wilkes, formerly the sort of leader of English radicalism, who is by this stage the alderman for the ward of Farringdon Without in the City of London, and as an alderman has judicial functions, when the Gordon riots are on, he gets soldiers together and he marches them off to the Bank of England, and these soldiers fire on the crowd along with other soldiers there. And his action is conspicuous, partly because the Lord Mayor does nothing. And the reason the Lord Mayor does nothing is that so many people, I think, sympathise with Lord Gordon and the anti-Catholic sympathies. So the anti-Catholicism that was widespread amongst much of the London mob militates against Wilkes' later reputation, because he's voted for Catholic emancipation and he's also been taken part in actually trying to suppress the Gordon riots.
And what legacy has John Wilkes left?
It's a complicated one. As I was saying earlier, he's often regarded as I think he is legitimately regarded as the kind of first modern politician in the sense of making a direct appeal to public opinion, in inverted commas. And this, as I was saying earlier, reflects the peculiar nature of the Middlesex constituency, the Middlesex electorate, which is very free of the kind of influences that otherwise dominated 18th century politics. But as I was saying, there's also his main vehicle for combating the government is the use of the law. And as I was saying earlier, I think this is a kind of rather traditional view of English liberty that's very much grounded in the common law and the traditional liberties of an Englishman. And he does make a speech in the House of Commons towards the end of his career in favour of male suffrage, but the radicalism will really take off after Wilkes's time with the French Revolution and with the dispersion of the idea of rights, that it's your right to vote. And I think Wilkes is a bit more of a traditional figure in many ways.
Fantastic. Ian, thank you very much.
Well, my pleasure, Hazel.